So I'm going to look at another episode in Elisha's life this morning. We looked at Elisha yesterday morning, and a tiny little story of feeding 100 men. And this morning, so yesterday's was only 3 verses. Today's is 16 verses. And it's the story of Naaman. Quite a well-known story, I suspect, but I'm going to read 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 to 16. Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means, go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he's trying to pick a quarrel with me?" When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to him to say to him, "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" And he turned and went off in a rage. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel, so please accept a gift from your servant." The prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. I bet Naaman didn't predict that his journey to healing was going to be as complicated as that. It's like my journey to get a decent cup of tea, isn't it? Whoever would have thought that it could be so tricky? Naaman, a commander of the army, high ranking. The word that is given there as commander actually could mean prince. So he was well ranked. Could have even been in charge of the whole army of this king's army. And he was privileged in this role, in this rank, because he was highly regarded by his master, the king. He was valiant in service, and his leadership had secured victory in a skirmish or something against Israel. And wait, that's all in verse 1. So this man is held in high esteem. He's good at what he does. He's well regarded. He wasn't an Israelite. And during a battle with Israel, a young girl was captured. And she's now serving Naaman's wife. You would have thought the perfect life, wouldn't you? Good job, good at his job, well paid, wealthy, serving the king, victorious in his accomplishments, household wife, serving girl, perfect, isn't it? But he had leprosy. And I don't have to say anything about leprosy and the impact of leprosy. I'm sure you all know the devastating consequences of having leprosy in these days. No cure, outcast, unclean, just the worst of the worst of the worst. So this is a man with great military success, but he has a personal tragedy. And that's probably true of many of us, isn't it? On the outside, it looks like all is going beautifully, swimmingly well, but there's personal tragedy somewhere inside, somewhere in the past. And it may not show, but it's there. And I admire this servant girl, that's been brought from Israel, because she's clearly supportive of her master and her mistress, because she could have just ignored the fact and thought, that he's got leprosy and thought, hard luck, You've stolen me away from my home, you deserve it. But she doesn't. She says, if only my master would see the prophet. If only. If only. Such an expression of longing, isn't it? One of the commentators that I read said it's one of the saddest expressions in the English language, if only, because it's full of longing, it can be full of regret. There's a kind of a resignation about it sometimes. If only. Doesn't have much hope, does it? If only. If only. Have you got an if only in your life, in your thinking? If only this, everything would be fine. If only that, all would be well. If only. But this girl acted on her if only because she said it to her mistress, who told her husband, who went to the king. And as I was looking at this story yesterday, I thought, isn't it fascinating? Every other story of leprosy you read, they're not at home, they don't have access to anybody else, they're outcasts, they're unclean. This man doesn't. He's still living at home. He has access to the king. He seems to be able to come and go where he pleases. There's no doubt he has leprosy, I think, but it's odd, isn't it? Anyway, on the word of this girl, he goes to see the king. And the king says, go. I'll even write you a letter to the king of Israel so that you can go in and, all will be well. Naaman is a wealthy man, and he takes with him on this journey, we learn at the end, chariots and horses, but he also takes 750 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, and 10 sets of clothes. I don't know why the 10 sets of clothes. Were they for him? Or were they a gift? I don't know if that was his suitcase or quite what that was about. But anyway, one of the calculations of how much that is of value these days is about 1.5 million. That's a lot of money, isn't it? A lot of money he took with him. Was it a gift for the king of Israel? Was it a gift for Elisha? Was it an assumption he'd have to buy his cure? I wonder what that's about. But I think it kind of says how much his healing was worth to him. How much is healing worth to you? What would you give, pay, spend, do? I wonder if it was just such an easy equation. Do this, healing comes. Not as easy as that though, is it? The trouble is, what the letter to the king of Israel neglects to do is to mention Elisha in all of this, the prophet. And the king gets upset at the implication that he is to cure Naaman. And he sees it as an opportunity for trouble to be stirred up between the two nations. Isn't it interesting how things can be misinterpreted? We looked yesterday at the story of the 100 men and these 20 loaves of bread, and how the servant, through his eyes, said, it's not going to be enough, and how Elisha said, give it to the people. And there will be, the Lord says, there will be some left over, and there was. The eyes that we see these things with, and the eyes of the king here, got it very wrong. Could have stirred up a war, but didn't happen, fortunately. But he tore his clothes, and in the Jewish culture, that is a dramatic gesture of grief and mourning. Such was his sense of dismay at this letter he had received. And at this moment, it's all about the king. We know nothing of Naaman's response. We know nothing of Naaman's reaction. You know, kind of, he probably set off on this journey with great hopes, and now he's nearly caused a war. Didn't see that coming, I don't suppose. Hurt, upset, defensive, suddenly trying to defend his master. Hopes dashed. I bet you know how that feels. You know, hopes high, anticipating change, something's going to happen. Gone in an instant. Exams failed, hope of uni gone, and in that desperation, you don't hear the rational voice that says, but you can ring clearing, they might have a place for you, they might find you a place. You don't hear that, do you, in that desolation, in that moment? It's like having the possibility of a new treatment for your illness. You hear about it, they tell you about it, and then you don't qualify because your bloods are wrong, or something's gone wrong, or you're in the wrong postcode, or something like that. You know, your hopes are up here, and suddenly the carpet's taken from under you. And I wonder if that's how Naaman felt. Set out with such expectation, and it's all gone wrong. Perhaps it's time to go home. Forget it. And we don't know the time frame here, but somehow Elisha gets to hear that the king has torn his clothes. He doesn't seem to hear that there's a man looking for healing. He hears that the king has torn his clothes. How did he hear that? Was it the gossip of the courts, or did he get a God nudge? I'll leave you to decide. But he acts fast, and he sends a message to the king and says, send the man to me. So you can imagine, can't you? Naaman setting out, hope, expectation, rising again. He's going to see the prophet. He goes to Elisha's house with his horses and his chariots. But his assumptions are all wrong all over again, aren't they? Is this display of wealth going to get him his healing? Naaman stops outside the door of Elisha's house, and the prophet sends a message to him. Be like being invited to the Buckingham Palace garden party and not seeing the king, wouldn't it? Or being invited to 10 Downing Street and not seeing the Prime Minister. It's that kind of thing, isn't it? He goes to the prophet's house and he doesn't see the prophet. He gets a messenger. Talk about being let down again. This poor man hopes up, hopes down, hopes up, hopes down. But that's what life's like, isn't it? I bet you all have been on journeys like that. Expectations well and truly not met. And you would, wouldn't you, expect the prophet to come and see you, to pray for you, to lay his, he might not touch you if you've got leprosy, but to lay his hands on you. None of that. None of that. Instead, he's sent away with an instruction, wash 7 times in the Jordan and you'll be cleansed. Actually, that's the usual word used in connection with leprosy, cleansed. Naaman's livid. Why hasn't Elisha come out to see him? Why the Jordan? Why not the prettier rivers of his own country? He goes off in a rage. Mind you, I have to say I don't blame him. I don't know if you've been to Israel and been around the Jordan. I went on a pilgrimage and we went to the Jordan and people were invited to renew their baptismal vows. And there were a couple, or be baptized, and there were a couple who wanted to be baptized. And they were told to wear clothes that they didn't mind if the stains didn't come out. Yes, it was a little muddy. Anyway, perhaps it wasn't like that then. But nevertheless, he didn't fancy the idea of washing in the Jordan. Doesn't make sense, does it? He must have had water on his leprosy patches time and time again. Doesn't make sense. Poor man. His quest for healing hasn't gone well. It wasn't even his idea in the first place, was it? He's upset the king, he's been ignored by the prophet, and now he's humiliated in the instructions he's been given. And he stomps off in rage. And as I read about this, quite often people comment on his arrogance. But I wonder if there's something different going on here. I wonder if actually his rage is an expression of his profound disappointment. Have you ever known that? You know, when you've been so disappointed, so upset, that actually it's expressed in anger. You're not angry. You're so hurt that actually it comes out as anger. And I wonder if that was Naaman's experience at this moment. So upset that actually it just came out as anger. Poor man. The instructions don't make sense, but we've seen that in Scripture before, haven't we? Build an ark, sacrifice Isaac, crucify the Son of God. Don't make sense, do they? The wisdom of God is not always obvious to us, is it? What I find interesting about this story is that there are 2 turning points in it. And both of those turning points come from a servant. The one that probably doesn't have much of a voice, the unseen one, the hidden one, the ones that are, kind of behind the scenes. It was the servant girl who said, if only he should go and see Elisha. And now it's Naaman's servant that says to him, look, if he'd asked you to climb Mount Everest, you'd have done it, wouldn't you? So why don't you do this simple thing of washing in the river? How much more? I could go off on a tangent there, because there's a principle of how much more in the New Testament, but I won't. Go and explore it, it's lovely. So what do we see in this story? Because of course he washes in the Jordan and he's cleansed. What do we see? Well, Naaman had to pursue healing, didn't he? He had to pursue it. The ups, the downs, the difficulties, the upsets, all part of the journey. 2 quiet, insignificant voices were highly influential. And I don't think we should dismiss the quiet voices. Maybe you are a quiet voice. You don't think you're anything much. You don't think you're anybody. You don't think you have anything to offer, anything to say. But a quiet voice in the right moment to the right person can be powerfully used by God, and you may not even realize you've done it. And when we hear that quiet voice, we should not dismiss it. Yes, obedience was required, even when it didn't make sense. His wealth, his position, his rank had nothing to do with the healing he received. He tried to pay. Have you ever done that? Tried to pay God for some healing that you are seeking in some way? And I don't mean by money. If you do this, God, I'll do this. And God says, no. You do that, and I'll do this. We try and bargain our healing, don't we, often? He had to surrender, I think. He had to surrender to what didn't make sense, what seemed stupid. He had to surrender. It's a funny balance, isn't it? We don't earn our healing, we don't pay for it. It's not a thing that's deserved or undeserved. But we do have to be obedient if that's required. We do have to surrender to God's way, not ours. And sometimes that is surrendering to not being healed in the way that we hoped.